Hello and welcome to another podcast edition of Taiwan Talk. I'm Keith Manconi. It is only a few days now until the inauguration of President Elect Tsai Ing-wen, and the public has a lot of expectations for her presidency. But perhaps one of the most anticipated and controversial pledge is that to confront Taiwan's authoritarian past by carrying out a program of transitional justice. Now, of course, for many, such a program would be a welcome and long-awaited opportunity to address historical wrongs. But there really is no way to untangle history from modern politics, and many see here nothing more than a thinly veiled pretext to carry out a political vendetta against the KMT and its members. So this term, transitional justice, it appeals to human rights, it appeals to a deeper sense of historical justice, but there are many different ways to view it. So to get some clarity, we're going to be speaking today to Dr. Ernest Caldwell. He lectures in Chinese law at the School of Oriental and African Studies School of Law in London. He also studies human rights in Asia, and he joins us now. Dr. Ernest Caldwell, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Just to start things out, this term, transitional justice, it's very abstract, almost wonky. I imagine some of our listeners may not know exactly what we're talking about. But that's also because I think a lot of observers here don't know what we're talking about. Over the last couple of months, we've had a number of forums throughout Taiwan kind of trying to answer the question, what could transitional justice mean in the Tsai administration? How exactly could she carry out this program that is aimed at, confronting some of the more troubling parts of Taiwan's history? So maybe you could just get us started by laying out some of the possibilities of what this could mean.
There are actually just numerous things because the concept of transitional justice itself is fairly broad, and it is meant and been interpreted and been applied in various ways via UN resolutions, via various different countries that have had to deal and different regimes that have had to deal with the transitional justice issue. And if you look at these comparatively, they've all been different and sometimes in very key ways. From the Taiwan experience and from what I've been able to gather from various, as you said, academics, from the public, as well as from political figures, transitional justice can mean a lot of things right now in Taiwan. And I think that one of the key issues that needs to come up is sort of prioritizing what transitional justice is going to mean, especially for the general public, as well as for the new administration coming in. And so we've seen in the past, for example, even during the KMT era of the 1990s, transitional justice meant oftentimes truth-finding, acknowledgement of various acts carried out during the martial law period. So you have the acknowledgement of the 228 incident, the aftermath of that. You have the setting up of compensation commissions and investigation commissions for victims and family members of victims. So there's already a history there that people can draw on when they think about what transitional justice would be and can look like in the future. You also have during the Chen Shui-bian era, for example, changing of names, removing of statues. To an extent, some of this has been reversed by the KMT once the DPP lost the presidency. But what I think is interesting at this moment, we have what could be considered sort of a new transitional justice moment, is that for the first time you have the KMT not in complete control over the government. So you have a legislature that is DPP dominated, and you also have the presidency, and soon the incoming cabinet as well will be sort of a DPP and Tsai Ing-wen select committees. So I think this moment you could actually see a potential for the government to either expand transitional justice or perhaps create a new space for new thinking about what transitional justice could actually become.
Right. So you were kind of referring right there to past attempts to carry out some form of transitional justice. So this is not, a new idea. This is not a new program to Taiwan. Attempts have been made in the past. So some would question whether or not this is necessary at this point. Democracy has been around in Taiwan for a number of decades now. Some might ask, isn't it time to move on and really just pursue a normal political agenda, the bread and butter issues that really affect people's day-to-day lives? But then others are clearly of the opinion that this is unfinished business. Transitional justice is not complete. So what do you see is behind that attitude? Why does that attitude that there's still more to be done, why does that still exist?
I think it exists for several reasons. And I think one reason is, in many ways, the unique position of Taiwan in the overall scheme of sort of comparative transitional justice. Because in many places, if you look, for example, at the sort of the post-Nazi regime or the fall of various Soviet states, oftentimes the former regime was dissolved. And so you have a rather relatively quick transitional moment wherein the people or various commissions, et cetera, can come in and sort of deal with transitional justice in a quicker method, perhaps. But with Taiwan, it had a very slow democratic transition comparatively. And it also had a transition wherein the dominant party, the one-party state party, the KMT, never disappeared and actually remained in power for a long time. And so the elements of transitional justice that were established during their during the early democratization period can be seen by a lot of people, I think, as insufficient because they were still done on the terms of the KMT. And so what people are wanting now, perhaps, is an expansion of what's going on. So yes, you had compensation claims. Yes, you had investigations into individual claims. But the truth-finding commissions, many people think, had their limitations. There are still archives of the KMT that have not been made open. It's one of the things that the DPP has been arguing for, is the need for truth. So one of the primary arguments that the DPP platform has been making is that truth commissions, sort of a more independent truth commission that is not necessarily tied to the KMT, is needed in order to open up more archives. And if you look at the sample legislation that's being discussed right now in the Legislative Yuan on transitional justice, one of the big things is creating a commission for a quasi-independent commission under the executive to basically uncover and unlock all the archives, both political and government archives, that have been closed off, even to the individuals who were doing the first commission report back in the 1990s. So that's something I think that they're really pushing for. And one thing that makes it easy for people to look back and say, well, transitional justice hasn't really come full circle yet. It hasn't been completed in a way. And another example, I think, would be the February and March incidents over the White Terror documents that made international headlines, both from the case of Mr. Wei, who was taken and questioned by the military police, as well as the 170-something personal letters of individuals who were executed during the White Terror period that post-2008 slowly made their way to the individual families that they were given. And this actually made headlines in the New York Times. And so I think for a lot of people, in a way, the truth is still out there. And a lot of people are hoping that Taiwan can, in some way, this new government can increase the awareness and the transparency of actually what happened during that time period.
Right. But then, we, of course, need to look at the flip side of all of this. Some people see transitional justice. Others see retribution, Obviously, the DPP would frame this as pursuing past historical wrongs, trying to address human rights abuses. But obviously, the form that this would take is the folks in power, the DPP, carrying out inquiries and maybe even trials against what would largely be members of the KMT. I mean, almost exclusively, it would be focused on members of the KMT. So it's very easy to see how this could become politicized quickly and at least be viewed as, political antagonism more than anything else. So is there a way to, do this without having politics front and center, without politics crowding out the legitimate goals of airing out historical grievances? Is that possible?
The short answer is no. It's as unfortunate as it is. It cannot not be political in a way. I think one reason why, as I said, the transitional justice is such a big issue is that because it's become a political force, because you now have a political party that has been advocating various aspects of it, and they haven't really had that voice, and now they actually do. So it's definitely political in a way. Furthermore, as you mentioned, the assets, party assets, are something that's a big call for transitional justice. And the assets that are being examined are the KMT assets. It's still one of the wealthiest political parties in the world. And so the fact that you have a party asset bill that's being discussed right now in the legislature, it can't not, I think, in a way, be interpreted by people, especially in the KMT, as something pointed directly towards them when for 60 plus years, that's basically the reason why a lot of this is coming up is because of the assets that the KMT has. What it could possibly do is make everyone accountable, sort of equal across the board if these acts get passed. But still, I think the biggest losers in this will be the KMT if they do pass, and they do have to actually divulge all their party assets and the histories of the obtaining of those assets.
So, I think we've already laid out there why this is going to be such a delicate and difficult project. But Taiwan is by no means the first country to confront this set of issues. Do you think that there's any historical precedent that Taiwan could refer to? Obviously, you mentioned Germany a second ago. Korea also went through, its own version of transitional justice. Is there anything that Taiwan can learn from those experiences? Or is Taiwan's own unique situation too particular? Is it, really just going to have to figure out its own path?
Well, I think it'll definitely have to figure out its own path because of its uniqueness, but it doesn't mean that it can't draw on other experiences. And I think the South Korean case is interesting because you have the President Park Geun-hye, who has a very intimate past with sort of a heavy-handed period of South Korean past. And in some ways, she has a similar position as Tsai Ing-wen because she came into a South Korean government that was having to deal with some fairly significant economic problems. So there were very sort of practical, real-world government issues that were confronting. But she also did a great deal sort of personally to revive sort of transitional justice thinking in South Korea. The negative aspect of that, while some of her transitional justice issues were successful, the economy hasn't been great in South Korea, and her party also lost their majority. The lesson I think that one could take from this is that while Tsai Ing-wen now has a fairly strong mandate, both within the legislature and her own sort of personal mandate via the recent election, the problem with transitional justice and the sort of the legislation and acts they're trying to push right now, in many ways they have a long-term perspective. But given the political situation, she has a lot of other things that that the government has to do in order to make this government last longer than just 4 years. And I think that's something that definitely needs to be considered when pushing transitional justice, that there are a lot of other things. And so the transitional justice that could be initiated in 4 years could be turned around if they lose the parliament or if they lose the presidency the next go-around.
Right, and that is, of course, a criticism that's kind of leveled against transitional justice projects from, the bluer side of the political spectrum. That argument basically being that, there's already so many pressing issues for Tsai to confront: energy policy, economic policy, international relations, all of that. that, if she spends all of her political capital, if the legislature is bogged down in fights over historical issues, there's not going to be any room for her to move forward with any other part of her agenda. So, if this project was really central to what her administration is doing, could it become an impediment for her to pursue those other goals?
Well, I think it will depend. I mean, right now, I think the issue is that in the legislature, the DPP has a fairly strong majority. And so that, along with their other coalitions, for instance, with the MPP, will make it so that it's not as difficult to push through legislation in the near future, at least. But I think part of the question will be how aggressively the new government wants to push this as sort of a top priority issue, and how much sort of political capital that would expend, and what the actual gain would be. If it gives people a sense of unity, and the problem with transitional justice for fairly long historical past abuses is that it can actually create a great deal of pragmatism in society as opposed to unifying. And so I think that if this is pushed aggressively, then there needs to be fairly clear outcomes other than just truth. So bringing up a purported truth can hurt as well as heal certain wounds. And so I think the question will become, well, once the truth is there and out, what's the next step coming up? And so from the legislation that I've seen so far, a lot of the Truth Commission type issues are merely just divulging all of the information, getting everything out in the open. But what actually comes of that, I think, will let us know really the success of the transitional justice and whether or not whatever level of, however aggressively Tsai Ing-wen pushes this, whether or not it was worth it in the end. When you do have, a flagging economy right now, and other big issues that are very prevalent, if this becomes the top priority and it doesn't really come up with much, and the economy continues to crash, then this could be extremely problematic for a second term and for the DPP in the next parliamentary elections.
Yeah, so I think that we've laid out there, some of the potential room for challenges, some of the perils that could lie ahead for this sort of project. Let's talk now about, what is the promise of transitional justice? If such a program is really carried out, it's really successful, how does that change society? What does it look like when a democracy has finally completed that and moved to a better place?
I think on one level, it would be a society that is highly informed. So the Truth Commission aspect, I think, is very important. If it can carry out its procedures and its investigations with a certain degree of independence and with a full disclosure of archives, as the current legislation is requesting, that government and political archives be opened up. So having a society that can know fairly precisely or what had happened, or at least read the materials and draw their own conclusions with the fullest possible amount of source material, I think is very important, because that allows people in many ways to sort of situate themselves within society. What themselves, their families, their friends, neighbors, what happened to them, having that doubt and those questions answered, I think is very important and allows people to sort of mentally reintegrate into a more unified society where everyone, in a way, knows where they stand vis-a-vis the historical past of the martial law period in Taiwan. That, I think, is very important. And I think the other thing would be what I think most people in most parties want is a clear understanding of the assets of, to be quite frank, the assets of the KMT, where they came from, the overall amount of these assets, and understanding which are or are not illicitly obtained, and then what to do with those. So in some instances, comparatively, people in Germany, for instance, after the fall of East Germany, a lot of the former Soviet assets were taken in, placed in trust, and are used for very public things. So parks, performances, supporting research projects, etc. If something like this could happen in Taiwan, it would be good. But showing that the assets, once they're declared and discovered, what actually happens to those assets becomes very important. And how the government, if they're given that option to do something with these assets, what they do with them can really would be, I think, a very important step for judging whether or not transitional justice has been successful in various stages.
Now, I want to ask kind of a difficult question. I mean, difficult in terms of I honestly feel uncomfortable even asking it because we do hold, human rights and a sense of fundamental justice to be sacrosanct and, incredibly important fundamental values for any society, especially a democratic society. But does there come a point where the practical issues, the practical considerations of pursuing a campaign like this and what it could mean in terms of the pushback, in terms of the distraction, in terms of all the difficulties that could come with it, is there a point at which transitional justice simply is not viable? It's not, worth it, to put it kind of crassly. Is that a legitimate question to ever be asking?
I think that it's certainly a temptation to think that in many aspects. I mean, if you look at tribunals that have taken place in parts of Southeast Asia, with Laos, Cambodia, discussions over Myanmar, looking at places like Rwanda, you're also dealing with places with extreme economic problems, but also very, very divided societies with large proportion of the society that has suffered extreme abuses. So I think that the temptation is always there, but it hasn't necessarily stopped that from coming up. And I think that on the one hand, the political gain from it, and this is political gain from both sides, it allows politics, if you have a transitional justice taking place, and if you have at least the ability to, or at least a consciousness that transitional justice to certain extents has taken place, it allows politics in many ways to move beyond a sole focus where transitional justice is not the primary focus of politics, as it sort of turned into towards the later aspects of the more recent political campaigns. And it allows focus on the economy, et cetera, those types of issues. It also allows you to sort of look afresh at social issues that may in part be based upon sort of the old mainland or Taiwanese divide. If these types of issues have sort of been ameliorated and you now have a more stable sort of social consciousness, then I think that there is gain to be had from there. But I think the question is always the extent to which one wants to push all of their capital into transitional justice at the expense of other issues.
Yeah, so, just kind of following the logic that you're laying out there, I guess it's kind of counterintuitive, but it sounds like what you're saying is that, in the short run, perhaps there would be a fairly high cost, fair amount of political capital, some societal strife, all that in the short run. But then in the long run, if society really can't get past some of these old wounds, in some ways it could bring the democracy to a better place where, a lot of these deeply divisive historical issues take a backseat for good, and the more bread and butter issues can be debated in a cleaner way, where all of that baggage isn't front and center.
Right. I think that's definitely the case. It lets them not necessarily take a back seat for good, but it allows them to occupy a space that is not as central as it may be. It allows it not to be as much of a hot button topic that for example, an opposing party can keep in their back pocket and pull out at the first sign of a political struggle. So I think that transitional justice is in many ways a long-term game. It's not something that can be done quickly. I doubt it's something that can be done within a single presidential or legislative term. But you can actually set up the steps for that quite well if it's done with sensitivity, etc. I think the steps can be taken quite positively.
All right. Well, we are going to end this very important conversation on that note today. We have been speaking to Dr. Ernest Caldwell. He lectures once again in Chinese law at the School of Oriental and African Studies School of Law in London. Dr. Caldwell, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you all for listening to another podcast edition of Taiwan Talk. Taiwan Talk is, of course, ICRT's weekly interview segment bringing you conversations from and about Taiwan. You can find the broadcast version every Monday at 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. right after the top of the hour newscast. You can also find it online at the ICRT website, on iTunes, and the ICRT blog. Please do leave a comment while you're there. We really appreciate hearing your perspective. Of course, Tsai Ing-wen's inauguration speech is going to be this Friday, just a little bit after 11 a.m. The other show that I host, Taiwan This Week, is going to be devoting the entire segment this Friday to going over what was in that inauguration speech and kind of looking at the significance for what it could mean for cross-strait relations, what it could mean for U.S.-Taiwan relations, and, just what it portends for the Tsai administration. So look for that show. Once again, it's Taiwan This Week. That broadcast at 8:30 p.m. this Friday. Look for it there. Or you can also find that online. There will be an extended podcast version of that as well. You can find that in all the same places you find Taiwan Talk. Just search for it, Taiwan This Week. All right, so all that good stuff coming up later this week. But we're going to have to leave this show right here. See you again next time. Thanks once again from ICRT and Taiwan Talk. I'm Keith Manconi.